Our attention to foreign policy. And in fact, Richard Nixon's whole goal in becoming president was foreign policy. He had seen himself ever since he first came to Congress as some sort of genius, some sort of master of foreign policy. And evidently he showed a lack of interest in domestic policy generally. He believed that he could end Vietnam, isolate the Russians, and actually thaw out the Cold War in a way that America would win. His primary advisor is Henry Kissinger, who's his national security advisor, and really in many ways overshadows Nixon in his foreign policy, and particularly in his diplomacy. He was a Harvard professor, and he was a German with a very thick accent and was often kind of stereotyped in this way. The plan, Nixon's secret plan that he promised Americans when he ran for office in 1968 to win the war in Vietnam, was called Vietnamization. And this means that we were going to have 60,000 American troops come home now. And the remaining troops in America, their goal was supposed to be not so much to fight the war, but to train the South Vietnamese that were currently there so they could take over the war and we could come home. By late 1972, we're down to actually 60,000 American soldiers in Vietnam as we're going down this path of Vietnamization, from a high of 540,000 at the height of the war under LBJ. And the anti-war movement begins to fade. People begin to get a sense that, oh, well, the war's ending. It's taken a little while, but it is scaling down. But in reality, we're no closer to a treaty. And when Nixon realizes that we're not anywhere near signing a treaty to end this war, he's going to make the decision to re-escalate the war, which incidentally is exactly what he said he wouldn't do when he ran for office. Early in his term, Nixon had started secret bombings of Cambodia and Laos, and at the time, nobody knew about it. Remember, the Vietnamese were using Cambodia and Laos for their Ho Chi Minh Trail to move weapons and soldiers up and down so we couldn't attack them. And so Nixon just said, well, let's bomb Cambodia and Laos, even though we weren't at war with those countries. Now, to be fair, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution had given us authority to attack any country in the region, so Congress had given him the authority. But he didn't tell anybody, which was it was going to be a problem. On April 20th of 1970, ground troops invade Cambodia and Laos. And when this begins to be reported in the paper, the anti-war movement explodes back into life. They cannot believe this war that Nixon had promised to end, that looked like it was on its way to ending, has now been expanded from one country to 3 countries. On May 4th of 1970, a group of students are protesting the war at Kent State, and National Guardsmen open fire, kill 4 students, and wound 9. On May 14th, just 10 days later, 2 black students are killed in a similar incident at Jackson State in Mississippi. Congress, angry that Nixon had expanded the war without consulting with them, repeals the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in December and puts the legality of Nixon's actions at question. Then in June of 1971, a study that the government had commissioned to write a history of the Vietnam War so it could be analyzed to figure out where it had all gone wrong, is given to the New York Times. It was supposed to be top secret. Nobody was ever supposed to see it because it has all the mistakes America made and a lot of embarrassing details. And one of its authors, a history professor named Daniel Ellsberg, is so disgusted by it, he knows what's in it because he helped write it, he turns it over to the media. He thinks the American people should know. The government tries to sue to stop the New York Times from publishing it, but the Supreme Court says it's covered under the right to the free press. The morale of the troops in Vietnam collapsed at this point, as we now have a second wave of major anti-war movements, and we begin to understand some of the inanity and the foolishness that has gone into the war up to this point. And then in 1971, here's a little clip from the Pentagon Papers if you want to pause and read that, about nuking Vietnam. In 1971, the American public learns of the My Lai massacre. This is a story about this man, William Cowley, you see there on the top, a lieutenant who had gone into a Vietnamese village, became convinced that everybody in the village was a Viet Cong, and had his soldiers massacre everyone in the village, including the children, and burn it down. There is no actual reason to believe these people were Viet Cong. I don't know if they were or not. But the military covered up this massacre, and when the people found out, they were very angry. There were investigations into this. I should also point out that these 500 people who were killed there were listed as enemy dead to pad our totals, which is kind of gross. But by now, Vietnam has become a nightmare. The drug addiction, racism, insubordination, and fragging are attacking fellow soldiers, or particularly your officers, fragging from the idea of in the middle of a firefight when nobody knows what's going on, you just lob a little grenade over it to the lieutenant or sergeant you don't like and kill him and take him out because y'all don't get along. These were all rampant in the Vietnam War by 1971. And by 1971, 2/3 of Americans are demanding that we end the war. But Nixon doesn't want to be the first American president to lose a war. Nixon, who was profoundly, really historically paranoid, will create an internal committee to investigate the anti-war movement and create a list of enemies. He sees these people as undermining his presidency, and he imagines if they weren't there, people like Paul Newman, the actor, if they weren't there speaking out against the war, then everything would be hunky-dory. And so he begins to blame the people who disagree with him. Nixon also ramps up the bombing. Easter of 1972 sees the biggest North Vietnamese offensive ever, even bigger than the Tet Offensive. And the South Vietnamese, the ARVNs, barely survive. And they're leaning heavily on American soldiers. Remember, we were supposed to have Vietnamized the war. Nixon responds to this by bombing Hanoi, the northern Vietnamese city of Hanoi, and putting mines off the coast of North Vietnam. Nixon, convinced he needs a treaty to win the 1972 presidential election, begins dropping demands that we've long had on the North Vietnamese. In fact, we stopped demanding that the North Vietnamese troops leave the South after the treaty. We're willing to give the South up if Nixon can get his treaty, declare victory, and move on. Kissinger negotiates with this man here, Lee Duc-Tho. Kissinger's in glasses there. And he gets a ceasefire a week before the election. And Nixon goes out in 1972 and tells everybody that he's ended the war. In fact, he claims he's won the war. But as soon as the election is over, the negotiations completely collapse. For one thing, because the South Vietnamese won't agree to a treaty that leaves North Vietnamese soldiers in their territory. And the talks end on December 16th. On December 17th, Nixon responds to the end of the talks with a massive bombing of North Vietnam that has incredibly high civilian death tolls. And we actually lose 15 of our massive B-52 bombers in this bombing. These are called the Christmas bombings. That's a nice name, isn't it? We stopped the bombings on December 30th of 1972. On January 27th of 1973, South Vietnam finally accepts the ceasefire. Nixon declares victory, but in reality it's a thinly veiled surrender. Lee Duc-Tho and Henry Kissinger will be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating an end to this war. You get $1 million for winning the Nobel Peace Prize if you didn't know. Kissinger will take his money. Lee Duc-Tho, who probably didn't have a lot of money to begin with, will return his $1 million to the Nobel Committee and say, I do not deserve a peace prize. There is no peace in my country. As soon as U.S. forces leave, the peace collapses. In March 1975, the North overruns the South altogether. By now, Henry Ford is president, and the South asks Ford to help, but Congress refuses to allocate the funds to do this. Saigon falls. You see here the fall of Saigon, and Vietnamese who had helped Americans trying to get on the last helicopter out of town. It's a very stark moment here. Many of them, of course, are not going to make it out. And Saigon is renamed Ho Chi Minh City after the North's leader. Another here's the National Monument to the Vietnam War dead, which is very powerful and moving if you've never been there. It's definitely worth a trip. Designed by a high school student, by the way. In neighboring Cambodia, our invasion of Cambodia had destabilized their government to the point where a brutal dictator named Pol Pot and his government, the Khmer Rouge, have taken over. And they will massacre 1/3 of the entire country of Cambodia and will ritually stack their skulls up like this. By the end of the war, there's 1.2 Vietnamese military dead, and more civilians than we can estimate. Over 90% of the vegetation of the country is destroyed, and the economy is in shatters. Vietnam will not begin to recover from the Vietnam War until the 1990s. And by the way, they don't call it the Vietnam War over there because that would be weird. They call it the War of American Aggression, which kind of gives you a different spin on how different people see different things. It's the longest war we fight until Afghanistan, which beat its record. We spent $150 billion. We lost 50,000 American lives, and 300,000 Americans are wounded. But it also shatters our confidence. We didn't believe we could lose before this. We had always won. We were America. We were always right, and we'd always won. And we began to question if we were always right, and we began to certainly question if we would always win. And it begins a dark period of introspection that's going to continue to the 70s.